it's a huge question mark what happens with tariffs. But if these can proceed and expand in the way that the White House is potentially, talking about, well, then you could start to see some moderate inflation effects starting, probably around mid-year, a little bit earlier. So exactly that place where the Fed could be gaining confidence and ready to cut, I think it's going to be difficult for them to cut as inflation is rising.
This podcast is for advisor use only and not to be distributed to the public. The Wealth Consulting Group is an SEC-registered investment advisor, and the opinions voiced and contents in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. The economic forecasts set forth in this material may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful.
Hello and welcome to the Bull of Wall Street podcast. This is episode number 16. I'm Jim Worden, the Chief Investment Officer for the Wealth Consulting Group. We are delighted to have our guest, Dr. Claudia Sahm, join us. So Claudia, you're the Chief Economist for New Century Advisors, it looks like.
Yes.
And you're also the founder and owner of Sahm Consulting.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So tell us more about those.
Right. So I am a macroeconomist. My training was at the Federal Reserve, and I, left about 5 years ago and have been out doing various kinds of policy consulting, worked with Congress on measures, worked with White House, other foreign governments, and then also do a lot of just what's happening in the macroeconomy, working with private sector. And about a year ago, I joined New Century Advisors to do that on a more regular basis for them. So that's been my exposure working inside the investment industry. So, but it's largely the same kind of themes: what's going on in the economy, what kind of policies are happening, where are we headed. Keeps me busy.
Well, that's awesome experience. A lot of background. So you were in academia, then you were at the Federal Reserve. Were you there? Did you know a Bill Helke by any chance? He worked with us with Wealth Consulting Group a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure that I met Bill, but
okay.
I think he was great people.
I think he was before Ben Bernanke.
Okay. Yeah. No, Ben Bernanke was the first chair I worked for.
Oh, he was there. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've had all this great experience. You work with Congress, the White House, foreign governments, and your specialty, well, at least maybe what we most know you for is the Sahm rule. So you have a rule named after you. I saw that in Bloomberg a little while ago. I think that's awesome. Not many people have something named after them like that. So tell us about the Sahm rule. What is it? What does it mean? What's it doing now?
Right. So the Sahm rule came out of this policy work that I've done. So when I was at the Federal Reserve, I was one of the leads on consumer spending. I started right before the Great Recession. I saw what an absolutely devastating recession and very slow, painful recovery that was. And I spent a lot of time, both in my policy work and in my research, thinking about fiscal policy. It might be very unintuitive that Fed economists spend time thinking about fiscal policy, but the Fed has to work around the edges. Like, they need to understand what these policies do. And so over time, I, through that research and knowing a lot of the other work that was being done, really tried to think hard about, well, how could we do the fiscal response better in the next recession? And one of the ideas was to create more automatic stabilizers. So these are ones where you take policies that are put in place to fight recessions and you tie them to economic conditions as opposed to the political whims of the moment. But to do, to make it, I was part of a policy volume in 2019, and to have a concrete, proposal of, say, send out stimulus checks, but only if the conditions are right in the recession to kind of get things going. You need to have a rule. Right. So the Sahm rule really was the supporting actress in this endeavor. It was all about how to do better fiscal policy, how to design the stimulus checks, who should they go to, and then, but you needed a trigger. And so that's what I looked through the historical record at, what are the kinds of macroeconomic patterns that we see early in a recession? It needs to be accurate, but it also needs to be early so we can act. And that's where looking at, relatively small changes in the unemployment rate, which is what the Sahm rule basically is, those have historically, though not perfectly, been quite accurate. And it's a very simple rule. It's just looking at, changes in the 3-month average of the unemployment rate. And so it's gotten a lot of attention, but really at its core, it was about how to do better fiscal policy.
That's so fascinating. I've looked at the Sahm rule and just unemployment in general. It feels like that has been a much more accurate indicator about recessions than any yield curve or some of these other measures that people look at. I mean, every single time that we've had a recession, the unemployment rate spiked. Is that accurate,
Right.
or were there times where we didn't have a recession and unemployment spiked?
No, in the United States, we've never had a recession without a notable increase in the unemployment rate. Now, there are some countries, Germany has a lot of policies to keep workers on the job in recession. So they, instead of giving money to the unemployed worker, they give it to the employer. And so they have, that can really smooth out. But in the United States, the way our institutions work is in a recession, workers get laid off, and then we help those workers through unemployment insurance. So we see increased unemployment rate. Now, the Sahm rule was about trying to find what's that increase in the unemployment rate, like the smallest possible.
Yeah.
That only happens in recessions. And in fact, last year, both, and the yield curve also took it on the chin during this recovery. But last year, we did have the Sahm rule trigger. So the unemployment rate rose a little more than a half a percentage point, with this 12-month look back, and we did not have a recession. Now, I had spent a lot of time, well before that happened, saying why this time could be different, and, we have changes in labor supply. So it's not perfect. Like, there's no perfect indicator. And yet the logic of it, the unemployment rate starts rising, even relatively modest increase in unemployment rate, like a half a percentage point, often end up kind of snowballing. You get this negative momentum going. They end up snowballing into, in a typical, I think the most mild recessions in the United States have had at least 1 to 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, and the most severe even more. Right. So you are correct. The unemployment rate definitely is it's very much an identifier of a recession, but it's also the reason that we fight recessions. It's very much at the core of like why recessions are bad.
So, Claudia, do you think part of that is because employers get nervous and, employees might start spending less, and there's kind of this, I don't know, psychological impact? I'm actually thinking a little bit of that right now with this government efficiency, and what does that do to the average employee? Do they start saying, I need to scale back on spending? And that has kind of a trickle effect on growth. And then if companies start saying, maybe we need to start scaling back too, what do you think?
Absolutely. So there is an animal spirits aspect to a recession where there's enough unemployment out there that people start thinking, I could be next. Right. And so then that can, even if you think there's a chance you're going to lose your job, you might put off that big purchase that you really don't need, but would be nice. And so if you're afraid you're going to lose your job, you hold off on it. You delay it. If you don't lose your job, if things get back on track, you go out and buy it. But there can be a pullback, and what can happen is when it's a recession, it can happen you can get a very concentrated kind of amplifying people. It's a fear factor. And I think, while, and I've been thinking a lot about this Doge, if we're going to have a Doge recession or not, but it is the case that when you're in the federal government sector, which is a relatively small sector, I mean, that's the thing that would makes the jump from a recession in the federal government sector to a U.S. recession. I mean, there's a big scale issue between going the two. The federal government employees are less than 2% of all employees. But if you think about just among federal workers right now, DOGE in particular, because it has chosen to have this move fast and break things mantra, so it's moving very quickly. There's not a well-defined plan. They're really like leaning into the uncertainty. Like if you wanted to try to cause a recession, I mean, which I don't think they're trying to, but I mean, leaning into that uncertainty is like, at this point, until the process is finished, until the reduction in force is completed, much later, any federal government employee with some pretty limited exceptions, like their chance of losing their job is much higher than it was this time last year. And so again, if you're going out, are you going to buy the house? Are you going to do the big purchase? And so it can end up changing, that uncertainty can end up changing the behavior of people who in the end won't be touched by the policy. Like they'll keep their job, but they just don't know right now.
Yeah. So that uncertainty is going to make people maybe hunker down a little bit more, which I feel like that would be good for inflation maybe. And, also like if we can reduce the deficit, if we can reduce fraud and waste, that would probably be good for inflation and, just government spending, but it's bad for growth too, right?
Yeah. I think in general, the uncertainty, the animal spirits, these are very hard to control. Like once the genie's out of the bottle. So while it could, there is a reasonable case, the federal government, as often happens, I mean, there has been an increase in federal government employment following the pandemic. And this would be a pretty natural time. And there are plenty of other administrations that come in and say, we're going to do a reduction in the size of the government. Some actually do it, some don't manage to pull it off.
They'll say it, but not all of them do it, right?
But I mean, like during the Clinton administration, there was like 400,000 net reduction in federal employment. It was a very substantial, it was done over several years and with a lot of process around it. So you got, I think it's this, I can see the argument for the reductions. I mean, I may not agree with it, but I can see the argument. The argument for the uncertainty and the breaking things, that's a lot harder. Because it has the potential to concentrate. Like we don't need everybody cutting back on spending right now, all the government workers. We may need it like slowly over time. So I think that the dynamics of it I find worrisome, but it's not, economic policy is designed for a lot of different purposes. And I mean, DOGE is not there as a counter-cyclical stabilization tool, right? Like it has its purpose. It's just some of the things they've chosen to do, I think, are amplifying recession risks that otherwise I would feel fairly comfortable just dismissing out of hand. Like this probably has a drag on growth, but not a recession risk. But some of the things they're doing where the uncertainty, where it's like you gotta keep an eye on it.
Interesting. So you don't think that the potential for a recession is much higher now than it was, say, a few months ago, or is it a little bit higher?
I don't think it's particularly elevated. So, I mean, recessions are relatively rare events. They do happen. So I'm not ever probably going to be a believer in that we've conquered recessions. Like we don't have to. I mean, macroeconomy.
We're not going to have any more because we're so efficient or whatever.
Yeah. So I think those risks are always there, and one needs to be vigilant about it. But I don't see them as particularly elevated. I do think the U.S. economy and some of these policy choices of this administration are emphasizing this. I do think we're going to see likely a moderation in growth relative to what we've seen in the last few years. The US has been exceptional in that its recovery out of the pandemic has been a above trend growth, like 3% GDP growth, real inflation adjusted GDP growth, 2.5%. And that is running in the same period that we were having inflation come down, right? So, I mean, we've had this kind of growth dividend that I think that's probably running its course. But even going from the 3 to the 2.5 down to something 2, a little less than 2, I mean that's really close to our before the pandemic pace. So I'm expecting that growth slowing, but there are, when you're kind of headed in a slowing direction, there are risks around that. So
Interesting. How about with earning? Our earnings have been pretty good, and like, especially we see these, these large technology firms that are driving AI adoption. There's hyperscalers, and they're just making, some of them are making a lot of money, and there's maybe some, thoughts that this is going to work its way into other sectors, and they're going to be more productive. So is that kind of an offset to the growth? Maybe it's not so much growth from consumers, but margin expansion on the corporate side. What do you think?
Right. So I think when we're like the time horizons are really important here. So in the earnings, what's embedded in stock prices, those can be looking out quite some time, right, in terms of the productivity
Sure.
gains that we could see. Whereas when we look in the macroeconomic data, we look at what's the labor productivity measures, which have in the U.S. labor productivity in the last few years also had picked up some relative to trend. That it's unlikely that that's coming from artificial intelligence. That's probably more, we got a little bit of a boost from maybe more flexibility, work from home. We moved workers around a lot in the
Mm,
pandemic. It was very disruptive, but it also helped probably with better matches, like people being in the right
interesting.
place and being more productive. So it's not, and there are definitely signs the AI technology adoption at the kind of the business level, like really putting in place, it's starting to happen, but it's not at a place where one probably likely would expect a lot of like it to show up in the aggregate data
Oh
this
yeah, it's too
year,
early.
next year. It's too early for it to be at scale, right? Like it's
Yeah.
happening, but so there's this I think the there's a lot of promise, and I do look at the artificial intelligence as probably being something. This could be something more of a game changer, right? I'm not dystopian about it. I think it's actually a tool that helps us or workers do their jobs better, as opposed to just like replacing all of us. I mean, there'll be some
Yeah.
employment effects, but it's also that's going to take time, and frankly, it's those kind of productivity, like kind of these more fundamental shifts in general use productivity, like that. Those are hard to predict, and I'm sure we will have fits and starts in
Oh
it.
yeah, it's not a
Right.
straight line, right? It's
Right.
gonna look like it's better. It's lumpy, right? We're gonna have
Yeah.
some up and down with that. And but then I guess from another follow up question to that is like the ability for it to disrupt, and some jobs would disappear, other jobs would be created, and then you've got this labor market that I feel like we still haven't recovered from the pandemic. There's a lot of people that have not come back into the workforce, and maybe that's because they don't need to. I feel like a lot of them
Mhm.
don't need to, like the wealth um disparity between the haves and the have-nots have gotten wider and wider and wider, and that seems to be making up, the wealthy seem to be making up more of what the average is in terms of spending and assets. What do you think?
Right. Well, and we have a long-standing demographic pattern to it as well, with an aging population, labor force participation rates falling. For those, and that's why we saw in in the and I agree, in the recovery from the pandemic, it was quite surprising how long it took workers to come back. Like the huge
Yeah,
declines in the labor force early on, and then even as the labor market got going, even as we had labor shortages that were really pushing, you know, employers to raise wages and be more accommodating. Like it really took time to get the labor supply going. And in fact, a big piece of filling those gaps with the labor shortages came from immigration. It wasn't entirely like
yeah,
there certainly was a case where we had the labor market was really like firing on all cylinders, and so we saw groups who were off who maybe might be more typically marginalized really increase their, like prime age women's labor force participation hit an all-time high, and Black men's labor force participation hit an all-time. So I mean, like the labor market was really pulling people in, but
yeah.
the big numbers came from the immigration, which is not. I mean, we're seeing that all unwind now.
Interesting.
So we don't have that same push. So I think the labor force participation, as a aging workforce, and maybe, if the immigration isn't the way to meet those labor needs, then to the extent that we can meet them with technology, that could be a real benefit.
Well, we had Dr. Kelly on last week for our podcast, David Kelly, and so one of the things we talked about was robots and robots helping. Like maybe that's, and it's not going to happen right now, but maybe that helps the gap with the demographics. If people aren't having any more children and there's not that much more people immigrating, I don't know, maybe that helps some.
Yeah. Probably will.
How about the policies you mentioned before, like the policy, with the Sahm rule, you kind of created that was a trigger to say, okay, we need to start helping out. Do you think that we did that maybe too much during the pandemic with stimulus checks and whatnot? And then I don't know where you draw the line to say, okay, that's enough. We need to stop. Right. Because then you had two different presidents, but it's kind of interesting to think like, are workers ever disincentivized to work? I remember talking to one person that was making more money to not work than to work. And I thought, well, that's kind of wild.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think I think that's a very good example of, things that we can do to improve our policy tools. So with unemployment insurance, again, that's one of our primary bulwarks in a recession, is to help those who lose their jobs during the pandemic. Because it was during a pandemic, there was a decision not just to help people get by financially, but also to make sure they had the incentives to stay home. I mean, early in the pandemic, right? So
that's true. Yeah.
So the idea was, okay, we'll take the unemployment insurance benefits, which are usually maybe somewhere around 80% replacement rate at the high end, the 60 to 80% replacement rate of your wages before you were laid off. And so why don't we take those to 110%? So replace it in full, give it a little bit extra. And some states said and states who administer the unemployment benefits actually cut the checks. They said we can't, because it's too complicated a change to the formula.
Oh,
and we can't do that quickly, because these are all these are programmed in COBOL, and like our systems are really complicated. They said what we can do is we can just add a dollar amount. So the policymakers went back. $600 is the median for the median worker. This is what it would have taken to get them to 110%.
Yeah.
So they added $600 a week and to everybody's, but then that meant that you had a whole group of workers who were going to be making now more than they did
when they're working.
More than they did, and it came back to just a glitchy, broken computer system, which is just outrageous, right? Like that, those
Yeah.
kind of things just shouldn't be what's, and that's why, I mean, the work that I've done with others is like trying to get prepared for the next like fix those
Sure.
systems so that like you don't have that happen.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not until a crisis that these things get attention,
Oh, yeah. You have
right?
to
And
do that.
so,
You have to fix it before the crisis happens, not during.
yeah, yes. So that's just an example of like that was not a policy decision to be extra generous. That was a limitation. I mean, they wanted 110% replacement is generous, but like they
Yeah.
wanted, there were limitations. So, but this question of like, did we do too much? Did we do the right thing? I think, while I was at the time very supportive of the stimulus checks, I am still supportive of the stimulus checks. I would never have put the biggest check last, and the whole
Oh,
sequence of them could have probably been smaller, right? But this
interesting. So
goes
you would probably had it more front loaded and not like more at the end.
right. I mean, the justification for the checks is to like, part of it is to try to short circuit that downward spiral in the
Sure.
economy,
The
right? And so you
backstop,
want,
right?
it's the backstop. It's the thing to help maybe cut off that animal spirits loop, right? Like, of I could lose my job and this could be bad. We said, well, there's help. The
Yeah.
government's here. We've got a backstop, right? And so if you're going to do that, you want to like the backstop should happen. The biggest backstop should be when the hole is the biggest, right? And so
Yeah.
what we saw, and I mean, the chapter I'd written in 2019 did talk about not just the Sahm rule turning it on, but also like how would you scale it?
Oh,
Would
yeah.
would you repeat it? Now I will admit,
Sure.
like the turning it on, like there's a simplicity to it, like because it's like saying we're in a recession, turn it on, right? Like that's very similar. But this idea of like tying it to how large is the economy, tying it to how is the unemployment rate going down, like it's more art than science. But at least if you put some guardrails on it, you'd have, and these kind of things would be agreed to ahead of time, right? But
Yeah.
otherwise, you get in the moment, and particularly recoveries are tricky, and the politics takes over. And I want to have it, and so like, and then you end up with decisions that aren't as economically sound. And it's like, I do think that the government should be there as a backstop, should be helping to fight recessions. But it is true when we have severe recessions, they're very costly. So then it's like, what can we do to try to make sure that we get the biggest bang for the
Yeah.
buck? And we've
That's
got a lot more work to do on that piece of it.
it sounds like it. Well, and you mentioned COBOL. I think that was someone they commented also that Social Security was using COBOL, like trying to like fix that. So I feel like there's some good that would come from this Doge, like if as long as they don't break things too quickly, right? They can hopefully surgically fine tune some of that, patch some of those holes. But so I guess one question. So you were at the Fed for a while, and like part of the challenge is like I think you mentioned like trying to fit what the monetary policy is with the fiscal policy and try to get those more aligned. And then the Fed's mandate being, employment and inflation. Like, how does that? I mean, what's the optimal way of making that work? And what does the Fed need to do now to make sure that we don't, run the risk of a recession without causing inflation?
Right. And so I should say that with the Fed and the work that I and colleagues there then and many economists there now do, it's not such that the Fed is passing judgment on the fiscal policy or trying to neutralize the fiscal policy, right? Necessarily.
Sure.
But it's really trying to understand what are the likely fiscal policies and what are the likely economic effects. And so then kind of taking those as given, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty around it, but taking those as given, then it's a question of what does the Fed need to do to get us to maximum employment and stable prices, right? So it's very, and the Fed in particular, you can hear like Chair Powell, and this is true with any of the Fed officials, but he's very careful about this, is not commenting on the policies that are
Oh,
being
yeah.
considered right now, because I mean they're analyzing, that the tariffs are likely to probably have some boost to consumer price inflation, at least temporarily. There's
Sure.
probably some negative growth effects, but if asked about that, he's going to be very coy, because you don't want it to. I mean, some of these effects, might sound like commentary on the effect itself.
Don't
Like
want to
they're
comment
not.
on like whoever's in. Well, and they're
Yeah,
trying to stay neutral, right? Like
they're trying to stay neutral,
apolitical.
because I mean, this is the Fed's the Fed wants to have the ability to make its decisions about monetary policy in particular, right? And
Mhm.
so they want to have independence in what is the level of the federal funds rate, that they can set that based on economic conditions, their best judgment about what it takes to get to, 2% inflation and, low unemployment. And they don't want the political interference of the White House sending over people, taking over the process. And so the way the Fed kind of tries to buy that independence is by staying in its lane, right? Because if it's out there commenting on fiscal policy left and right, and like, are you kidding me, you're doing these tariffs, like all this stuff, well, then it's just inviting the reverse, right? The White House being much more
Yeah, or and
active.
and there, do you think there's a risk that they're going to say, okay, away with the Fed? I mean, like people sometimes talk about it. I don't think they would, but I mean, the way you see it, is that like a risk at all, or not so much?
So I think, this the Trump administration is has put some policies on the table that are not as orthodox as maybe your kind of
Hmm.
run of the mill, even Republican administration. So, like, I have kind of a mental list of like risks to the economy, risk to
Yeah,
institution, like economic institutions, that is probably a little longer than normally would be. I put risk to the Fed, like, not. I think there could be a lot of talk, right? I expect
oh
all kinds
yeah,
of true social poses, and like,
yeah. It's
and
all
that's
talk, but nothing happens.
fine. Like I mean, it
Yeah,
would be better if we weren't dealing with that. But I mean, it's not just like actually doing things that would like uh removing multiple governors at the Fed, so that there was a voting block of Trump appointed governors, right? Like things that would like interventions from the administration that would really change monetary policy, like hand the
mm,
keys over. I don't put that high of risk on them,
hmm,
because they have like financial like it would be clear what's happening, right? If you had
yeah,
these big interventions, and the Fed's independence, its ability to do its job, has a lot of fans on Wall Street, and I think for good reason. So I
sure.
think there are other like USAID does not have the same backing. Like it doesn't have the big heavy hitter like of a Wall Street backing as the Fed does. So I don't worry about the Fed quite as much. I think it could be noisy. The if you were in the space of bank regulation and supervision, I think the administration is taking some more steps to try and
Oh yeah,
potentially consolidate, but there's other agencies involved. So it's not just the Fed. So there's some things the Fed does that I might have some concerns about, but the monetary policy, I actually think this one is probably a of something in like reality interference, as opposed to just like words. I think is pretty low.
interesting. So where do you think the Fed is now? I mean, like, are you thinking that they're going to cut? We've talked about them, cutting maybe a couple more times, and maybe unemployment does come up a little bit, inflation comes down. I personally, I would love to see inflation come down, unemployment doesn't get any worse, and they can cut because inflation's coming down. That's what I would
Mhm.
love to see. We don't always get what we want, but what's your opinion on where they're at now and for the rest of the year, where they go?
Right. So they're absolutely in a wait and see mode right now.
Sure.
This the Fed, the Powell Fed has been. This is not new, but it definitely has increased even in just the last few years. This is a very data driven Fed. Like they want to see it in their like they want to see it before they're acting. Now this is actually, I mean, it's a very sensible approach given that it's been hard to read the economy. Like we thought
Yeah.
inflation would be temporary and then it wasn't, so like you can understand how we got to this point. It's very unusual for monetary policy. As we talk about, monetary policy acts with long and variable lags. Like it takes time for interest rates to have their effect on behavior. It takes
Hmm.
time for that to feed through to inflation. And so, and I think to a large extent that is still true. Like just changing interest rates doesn't change the effect on inflation right away. Like there are tails to this. And so the danger of then saying, well, instead of like, relying on my forecast where I think, oh, inflation's coming down. Like if I think inflation's already coming down, well then I could go ahead now
Hmm.
and reduce interest rates. But if I'm going to wait for it to show up in the data, and we know that it can take some time, well, maybe then you've waited too long to
Yeah.
cut interest rates. So it's a little that we've gotten so much into. I need to see a month of data, 2-3 months of data before we do anything. Like that actually is this is a somewhat risky stance to monetary policy. But again, I think of the choices, and it's not like they aren't looking ahead. It's just like to see them act, they're going to have the data. And so then right now we're in this case where inflation is still elevated. We're not that far from 2%, but we're not, it was a pretty slow uh, progression
Yeah.
last year. And, the beginning of the year, there's, depending on which inflation series you're looking at, it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of whether it was, heated up a little bit or, moderate. So, I think they're hoping to, I think their base case is probably not too far from what you outlined. That there's a path, for disinflation. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
encouraging signs, say on like the housing and the shelter inflation, which has been pretty tricky in recent years. So there is that path there, and the Fed has said, I mean, that they anticipate that they'll be doing more cuts, right? Like they're not in this like hedgy. Well, the next one might. I mean, if they
We
need to
might we
increase
might hike
rates,
next time.
yeah. I mean, if
They're
they
not
need to,
telegraphing that.
they will. But what they're telegraphing is more cuts. But they're
Yeah.
telegraphing it with a lot of patience. And
A
this is a
lot of
fairly
patience, a lot of
patient.
a long pause.
Yeah, this is a fairly patient institution. So if they're telling you they're patient, like this is we're really. And what I worry about is that patience could run into then, as we get the first half of this year. I think the inflation dynamics that we came into the year with do give us some uneven, but pointed in the right direction with some more disinflation. Um, but then we have policies, and again, it's a huge question mark what happens with tariffs. But
Hmm.
if these can proceed and expand in the way that the White House is potentially, talking about, well, then you could start to see some moderate inflation effects starting, probably around mid-year, a little bit earlier. So exactly that place where the Fed could be gaining confidence and ready to like cut, I think it's going to be difficult for them to cut as inflation is rising. Even if they can
Yeah.
say, hey, this is tariffs, hey, it's in goods, this is temporary, this is a price level reset. Like this is, like there's a way to justify it, but I mean, unfortunately, this was the case last year too. Like the next cut probably will be a pairing of some confidence I've gained on inflation and also some concerns they have about growth or the labor market. and that those two pieces come together. Because if it's just inflation that's come down, that's doing it's come
Yeah.
down, and then there's tariffs, then they might be like, well, why mess with it, right? If growth's
Yeah.
holding up, if unemployment's low, it's just,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. Don't touch it.
yes.
Interesting.
So I feel like
But
they're going to have some more pieces, but we did see last year that when the Fed started cutting, there were a lot of concerns in the summer. And the summer rule triggered. I think I helped contribute to this about like growth and a recession. But really, like if you kind of thought about the underlying dynamic, like the U.S. economy, it was still in a good place. There were risks. Right. So the
yeah,
Fed, when it was cutting, it was very careful. And I think this bore out in terms of what we saw afterwards. They weren't cutting because they thought the labor market was falling off a cliff. It was like an insurance. Like, hey, we made all this
sure.
progress on inflation. We've done a lot of cooling in the labor market. We don't want more. We don't need
Yeah.
more. So like, if we don't want more moderation, well, let's take those interest rates down some.
I
So
feel like a lot of that was right around when your rule triggered because everyone
yes,
was
not
talking about it, right?
it did before. Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, we saw the unemployment rate jumped in August and in the July numbers, and yeah, and then we had like a drumbeat of a variety of indicators that cause that often associate
Yeah.
with recessions. So, but I mean, I was adamant with the day the Sahm rule triggered. I was on the radio and I was like, the Sahm rule says a recession, and Sahm says no recession. Right, like this
Yeah.
just didn't have the features to it. But I thought it was notable, even as the Fed's saying, like, we're not falling off a cliff, we are not in a recession.
Sure.
I think there was at least one speech, like, kicking the Sahm rule to the curb, which is fine. But like but they still recognized it as interest rates are too high for where we're at. Like we need to like understand that like there could be there could be employment reform.
Yeah.
So this is a Fed that takes the maximum employment side of their mandate more seriously than like probably any Fed
Well, that's
that's
good. I feel
been
like
around.
that's a good thing, though, right? I mean, you want them to be more cautious there. Let me
Yeah.
ask you. You mentioned a while ago about the owner's equivalent rent, the real
Mm-hmm.
estate component. I feel like that's kind of a challenge here. It's just sticky. Like there's like the housing market is, I'm not going to say broken, but it's just difficult for obviously for people that are trying to, they're forming households.
Mm-hmm.
It's highly, highly unaffordable. And yet the people that own homes, I'm one of them, like, we're not going to sell. No one wants to sell
Mm-hmm.
because the rates are so high. And then you get this challenge with inventory, and there's more demand than supply, and then prices stay elevated or they move higher. Do we need to see something break in housing for that inflation to really come down, or do you think that we can kind of, I feel like people talk about landing the plane, soft landing and whatnot. Like, do we, at least from a housing standpoint, is there a way to land the plane without there being problems in housing?
Right. So on the inflation front, the uh, the shelter, whether it's the owner's equivalent rent or the tenant's rent, those month over month changes are starting to look quite similar to before the pandemic. So you're
Okay.
seeing in terms of price change. Now this is
Yeah.
with like well over a year delay. Like the lags have
Yeah.
been
Really,
very
really
long
delayed. Yeah.
to see this, but we're starting to see that kind of normalization in the inflation rates. Now it's going to take some time, to kind of add it up. So in terms of like year over year inflation, but we have, I think, probably largely turned that corner. Now that doesn't, that leaves in its wake still some real housing affordability issues. Right,
Hmm.
because this is about talking about the inflation looks like it's getting back to something more normal, but these price levels are still a problem. And then, like you said, inventory is still relatively low, and there are many examples of this. Housing is definitely one of them. We had some historic disruptions early in the pandemic. So like household formation, the demand for housing just like shot up early
Oh
because
yeah.
people wanted to move out, they moved around, they needed,
Work from
and then
home somewhere else.
all kinds, and at exactly the time where the supply was constrained, and supply like is going to always be constrained when there's a big change in demand because it
Yeah,
takes time to build, right? So
sure.
it just, but like that was, you know 4 years ago, right? And we still,
Yeah.
you get these echoes and these like finding balance, say like in multifamily construction, right? Like it
Mhm.
couldn't keep up with demand in the beginning. Then there was a surge in construction, and then like there were, open units, and then prices came down, and now we've
Then they
seen
built too many. Yeah,
multifamily.
that's right.
Then multifamily. So it's like you get a really big shock, and you can get these waves that over time they get smaller and smaller, but we're still carrying around the baggage. And I still think there's going to be a lot of interesting questions for the Fed about their monetary policy, both when they were being ultra accommodative with very low interest rates early in the pandemic, and then the switch to really, rapid increases in 2022. Like this caused a lot of these imbalances between like when rates were really, really low, everybody refied, they bought. So in some ways, like
Yeah,
that housing sector, which is where when the Fed starts raising interest rates, that should be one of their interest rate sensitive sectors where they actually have some bite. And like they had a lot less bite because that the kind of the market rate wasn't actually applicable to a lot of homeowners,
yeah,
right? Their mortgage rates were much lower. So it caused a lot of disruptions, and that going from like 0 to 5, with the funds rate. And but we're still, I think, with those kind of disruptions, while there's still a residual and we still are going to have these waves to them, housing has made a lot of progress towards its normalization. And many of the kind of potentially disruptive policies that are being talked about, like that have come online, like these don't touch housing, right? So it's kind of got its space to keep its normalization, but we're
interesting.
still left with an affordability and an underbuild of housing, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not.
How about like the wealth gap between like the haves and haves not? We talked about that with Dr. Kelly as well. What is your take on what can we do to help those people, lift them up? Is it education? Is it opportunities? Is it the other generation or wealth transfer? Because I feel like we that money stays in families, right? So and maybe that's one reason why it hasn't been more disruptive for some, but like for
Mhm.
others, it's highly disruptive, right? So for people that can't afford it. What do you think? What are the policies that the Fed can do, and what should the on the fiscal side? What can we do to improve kind of that gap?
Right. So, I mean, it's, the wealth gaps that we have in the United States are large, and they are very persistent. Right. So there's no magic wand here. I'm sure it's an all of the above in terms of the policies. I tend to be very much focused on how do we get the wealth at the bottom up. I'm a
Yeah,
little like I'm a little more concerned about wealth levels, people
sure.
having liquidity, kind of a set aside, as opposed to that distance, the inequality, right? Like if I could raise the
Oh, the
bottom,
distance, the gap,
and
the amount. Yeah,
yeah,
you bring
so it's
bring
a little,
everyone rising tide, lifting all boats.
yeah. I mean, I guess, or put. I find that the lack of wealth, the lack of a financial cushion at the bottom, I find that very, like, I think that should, to me, that's a real policy motivator. And they're different, probably a little different policies than saying it's not like we're not collecting equitable taxes from the rich, which I think you can have that
Mhm.
discussion at the top. So, but I've kind of focused on the thing about
Sure.
the bottom. And at the end of the day, one of the best things in term that we can do for the typical worker, I mean, for those who are really in need, we need to have a stronger safety net that, like,
Mhm.
picks people up off the bottom. But if you kind of think of, like, for a broad section of American families, like, one of the best policies we can do is make sure that we have a labor market that is really working.
Mm.
Right, that's the way that, having a good job, a sufficient paycheck, a career path, um, the ability of to you know enough flexibility and worker bargaining power, not necessarily in a union setting, but like enough bargaining power to get the flexibility they need to do their job. Right. One of the things that we saw that was really notable during, because we had the labor shortage and the recovery, which, were disruptive, but it did turn the tables. You saw wage increases at the bottom
Yeah.
that were just really notable. You saw workers, I mean, people who would need accommodations to be able to do their work, say if they have certain disabilities, employers willing, you saw employment rates among these groups of individuals rise because they get the accommodation. Like, if you need a worker, you're going to be more flexible. So a labor market that's really firing on all cylinders tends to be very good for workers who are often left behind. And so that's where I think making sure that we had, like, that's where the Fed, by doing, taking their maximum employment mandate seriously, can help with that. Now, we know inflation hurts workers, families too. So I mean, that you have
Yeah.
both sides of this, but I think policies that are focused on the labor market, on jobs, and it could also be, as you're talking about, like with skill building, education, right? Like, there's
Mhm.
a whole set of these, but to me, the way to get an important path to making sure people have the financial security is to make sure that they have the good jobs, the good paychecks, the and again, and it may be the uh, you know childcare, other accommodate, like other benefits that help make it possible for people to participate. I mean, it's not the only way, and again, nothing replaces the safety net, and I'm sure there are uh, inequity, like, we need the taxes to pay for all this. I mean, like, there's lots of different policies that could fit under your question of how to
Interesting.
address the wealth
Well, and
gap.
I feel like now, maybe because of technology has been kind of an enabler, there's a
Mhm.
lot of people doing jobs that they never did before, right? I mean, there are a lot more people delivering and Uber drivers, but then there's people that are making money from YouTube and,
Mhm.
dog
Mhm.
videos and things like that. So,
Yep.
so I feel like in some ways there's more opportunities, but yeah,
Mhm.
I'm just fascinated by all of it.
Mm.
So I guess final question, with all of the new tools and technology that's out there, do you think that the Fed and that even the government, like, is going to be able to measure the economy closer to real time, without all the lags, and maybe make the surveys a little bit more relevant in terms of, like, collecting the data? And I just always think of, like, the payroll number keeps getting revised, lots of revisions. Do you think we can get more accurate, having more real time data?
It's a challenge. The measurement, uh it and it's a question of resources too. There certainly are, I mean, there certainly are so many more real-time data resources than there were even like 5 years ago, right? Like, the private companies have been much more interested in taking kind of the data that their day-to-day creates, and, kind of processing and packaging. Like, what can we learn about the economy? Uh, it's the I don't know. So I'm very ecumenical. I love data. I think, it's good. I rarely turn my nose at data, but they do come with varying quality and with varying, like, timeliness isn't the only attribute like you want. And a
Yeah.
series that doesn't revise, well, if it's wrong, I'd really rather it did revise, right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah. Yeah.
so, like, there's a way to get rid of revisions, right? You just don't.
Quality is better than quantity, or like the
Yeah.
speed.
Yeah, and there often is a trade-off between how quickly we can get a read on the economy and how accurate that read is. So, but there certainly have been challenges. The Much of the government data that we have relied on and have, decades and decades of time series, which is often really important, right? You want to be able to compare now to the past. Many of these are coming from surveys of either households, individuals, or businesses, and it's gotten more and more challenging to get people to take time and out of their busy days and do those surveys. I mean, that's part of why they can be quite noisy because we just don't have, so it's like, okay, well, but we can scrape data. We've got administrative data. We've got private company data. So this is absolutely something that government statisticians and people that work with them are aware of. I got to work on some projects related to this when I was at the Fed with some private sector data, but it can be, it like I said, it takes resources, it takes time. And then at the end of the day, like, no matter how much data you have, how many numbers you're staring at, you got to be able to interpret them.
Yeah.
And there's no quick and easy way to that.
No
It's,
easy fix.
yeah, I mean, we have a huge, very complex, very dynamic economy, and that's a great thing, but that is a, like, immense challenge if you're trying to say, hey, where's this thing headed, right? So yeah, so I think we'll get better and better data. I think, you'll have it more timely. The government data is always improving, but we're still going to be asking what's right around the corner, even if we have the latest numbers.
So do you think just the collection, how we collect the data, and maybe like combining that with like machine learning and like how we're analyzing, do you think that improves, or maybe it doesn't change that much?
I think it certainly can give us new insights.
Maybe.
We're not gonna, it's hard for me to envision, like, we're just turning over the analysis, the economy, to a big algorithm.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like,
No,
I mean,
I
but
get that. Well, you know
we'll have
when you
better.
don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see where you're going with that, but yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Is there a better way of doing it? Like maybe make the surveys easier or get more participation.
Yeah, no, and this is absolutely the kind of, like, the government statisticians, like, their whole years long effort, and actually since the very beginning of these statistics in the 1950s, they've always been trying to do it better, because new things happen in the economy and we've got to measure it. Like, the Census Bureau started, I think, 2 years ago, a survey that had some pretty detailed information on AI use by companies. Well, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have had those questions on a survey. Like, that wasn't,
so they're adapting. That's good.
Yeah, so you have to keep adapting, but it's a dynamic game. Like, you're never going to get, like, all the way ahead. But yes, there absolutely are lots of conversations, and any of this can be done. These statistics can be done better, but you have to balance a lot of the timeliness, the quality, the comparability over time. Like, it's just, there's a lot of boxes to check. And with a lot of these statistical agencies have either had their budgets frozen or declined, and that well before this administration, right? Like,
Yeah.
of all the things you can spend money on, right? Like statistics. So
that's fascinating. Well, I really, really appreciate your time, Dr. Claudia Sahm. Thank you for joining us. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add. I don't know if you have like a market forecast for 2025.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been great. I do not have a market forecast, so for 2028. But one place, if anyone's interested, is I do write occasionally on a Substack. So Stay at Home Macro. It's a play on my last name, Sahm. So that would be a place if someone wanted to find some more of my writing
great.
and insights.
Here's Three's Company too. Come and dance on our floor. Take a step that is new.